Have you ever wondered how you would perform in a life or death situation? Today, we're going to look at that question through the lens of a couple of case studies where it was all on the line to see what we can learn. Welcome to episode 87 of Only Human. First, we want to do like we always do and start with some news from the world of human performance. It ties right into our idea today about life and death situations. And that begins with a headline right off of CNN News 15 minutes before I started the podcast. Authorities find man dead with firearm nearby hours after Idaho firefighters were killed in ambush. So most of you have probably heard this story by now, but on June 29th, a significant wildfire was reported near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, specifically on a place called Canfield Mountain. And turns out that the event was deliberately set in a pile of brush to lure in and target first responders. Dreadful. Almost unheard of in wildland firefighting. I think it's the first time I've ever heard of it. Now, according to reports, as the first responders arrived, a shooter opened fire, resulting in the deaths of 2 firefighters and injuries to at least one other, who is now being reported as stable after surgery. Initial reports on X and in various news sources, unconfirmed, but suggested that up to 11 people, firefighters and 2 police officers, may have been injured in some way. But these, like I said, these numbers remain unconfirmed at this point. This morning, the suspect was found dead on the mountain with a gun nearby. Sounds like he probably took his own life, like many of these people often do. We still don't know whether he acted alone. We still don't know any motive. But the shelter-in-place order was lifted, although the fire remains active, and it's bad fire conditions up there, so it's growing, and now the real firefighters are back in there fighting it. The fire size and containment status aren't detailed yet this morning, but I'm sure we'll hear more about it. I know that area a little bit, and it's brushy with a lot of dead fuels, and the weather conditions are definitely favorable for a fire spread up there. So we'll stand by for more details on this, who the shooter was, if he acted alone, what his motive might have been. But there's a couple of things I noted as I was watching the news nonstop from when it broke yesterday all the way through late last night when I finally went to sleep. And the first was the coolness of the radio calls from the firefighters into dispatch. You can listen to them online, but basically it's extremely professional. Hey, roll law enforcement. We're under attack. This fire was deliberately set. People have been hit. I think he says, this guy is down and that guy is down. I'm barricaded behind my truck. Hey, follow on truck, do not come up here. Right? So he just basically sized up the situation, and like the professional that he was, he called in all the information. In fact, he was the acting incident commander of a highly volatile scene. And it leads us to ask that question again. Obviously professional firefighter trained to deal with emergencies, but not that kind of emergency. So what is it that allows people to respond and manage life or death situations? And what is it that leads some people not to do so, or at least not to do it so well? How would you respond to something that was thrust on you completely unexpected? And the answer is you probably don't know. I've had 2 events in my life that I considered life or death situations, and the stories don't matter. But what I learned from them about me and how I respond has shaped the whole way I prepare for life ever since. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about those lessons later on. Okay, so that's a news of the day. The case study I want to use is an interesting one. I may have mentioned it once or twice before, but back in 2001, there was a multiple fatality fire up in Washington State. It was called the 30-mile fire. It was from July 9th and 10th through, I think it started on the evening of the 9th, morning of the 10th, and then the fire lasted for several days after that. Like I said, it claimed 4 firefighters' lives, and it really highlighted a lot of things about how we respond under pressure. And I want to focus on a few things like decision making and teamwork and leadership and that sort of stuff as we go through. But let me set the scene for you. So the 30-mile fire was sparked when a camper didn't drown out his campfire. Winds picked up, blew some sparks, and it was exacerbated by extreme weather conditions, high winds, low humidity, extremely high temperatures. A drought had been going on for quite a while. And the fire was called in, and dispatch sent out a crew that went by the name of Northwest Regular Crew Number 6, a Type 2 fire crew. So, real quick, U.S. Forest Service and BLM firefighters operate locally across their district, but they can be dispatched to anywhere in high fire seasons. This was a local crew. They knew the area, but they were a mixed crew with some people that had come in from outside, right? And when I say a Type 2 crew, whenever you're talking about incident command or major incidents, there are basically 4 levels. There's Type 4, who is just like a volunteer firefighter that showed up with a shovel, right? Type 3 is a trained firefighter, but without a lot of experience and isn't on a crew that's completely organized, right? But there are Type 3 crews out there. A Type 2 crew usually is experienced. They're led by a supervisor. They all have different jobs. They're cross-trained, et cetera. And a Type 1 crew, now you're getting into the elite, right? Now you're talking about the hot shots and the smoke jumpers and people like that, right? So this is a Type 2 crew. And it was led by a gentleman named L. Reese Daniels. You're going to hear that name a lot as we go through the story here today. And they were dispatched to what seemed like a routine fire. It was up in a canyon. They happen a lot in that area. Now, the extreme fire conditions they were well aware of. But they went in to fight the fire. And just to draw the terrain for you, it was like so many of these canyons in the West where you've got your mountains and the stream trickles down and then it gets a little bit bigger and it carves an area, a valley, if you will, that's got mountains, steep hills on both sides, and there's only one way in and one way out, right? And this happened to be along something that called the Chugach River Canyon. So they went up into the canyon. They started fighting the fire, and I believe there are 11 or 12 firefighters on Northwest Regular Crew 6 at the time. I'll remember a little more specifics as I go through and tell the story. But the fire got out of hand, and they really were having trouble controlling it. They called in some air attacks, some helicopters, and basically the smoke was blowing over it, and they said, hey, you guys get the hell out of there, right? And so they retreated away from the fire, and they went back outside of the canyon, and they stopped. And we called this spot later on the lunch spot because it's where they sat down to have lunch. Now, they called in, hey, the fire's too hot. We got chased out of there. Recommend nobody go back in. They did all those things they were supposed to do. As they're sitting there eating lunch, they see a local Type 3 crew, right, one further down from where they are, roll through their area headed in toward the fire. And they say, hey, wait. The guys don't check in. They roll past the fire. They make some comment about, we're going to fight fire. You guys can eat your lunch, right? And the team starts to have a discussion. Gosh, if the local guys are going back in, God, we should go back in too. And they they have a little bit of a discussion, and for one reason or another, maybe it was ego, maybe they didn't want to be shown up by a crew that had less people and less qualifications. Whatever reason, they loaded up and they headed back up the canyon. Probably decision mistake number one. Now, I want to stop for just a second before I tell you what happened next and talk about the team here. And it's a weird one, right? It was a mixed team from a couple of different areas. And I'm going to talk about gender and I'm going to talk about race because it mattered here, right? So the two senior people on the team were both African Americans. The actual supervisor, his name was Reese Daniels, highly experienced firefighter, but kind of a quiet man, right? Also on the team was a highly experienced, very charismatic man named Tom Craven. And Tom Craven was the second black man on the team, and he was like a world-class athlete. His family had all been experienced firefighters for years and years. Someone told me afterwards he even broke O.J. Simpson's junior college rushing record. Gives you an idea of the athletic capability of him. Like I said, very charismatic, but he's not in charge, right? But clearly the informal leader of the team. Then there were a few other odds and ends of relatively experience, anywhere from 3 to 7 years of firefighting experience, and then a couple of rookies. And in fact, one rookie was literally on her first fire dispatch. Right? There were some young women, there were men, mixed race, mixed groups that didn't always train together. Right? But in they go. Right? And that's not all that unusual in wildland firefighting in a high fire density year because you throw a lot of people together. Now, next thing that happens is they get in there, and as they're going in, they see that team that went in just a few minutes before them heading out saying, "Oh, fire's crazy in there. We got to get out of here." And so they turn around to follow the local firefighters back out of the canyon. But in that couple of minutes, it took them to turn the two rigs around and head back out. The fire closed the road, and now they're trapped. But here's the good news. They've got a few miles of road going back up into that canyon where the fire hasn't come yet. It's coming because fires burn uphill, and that's the way the wind direction is going, but it's not there yet. So the supervisor, Reese Daniels, says, let's head up the road. We're going to find a place that looks like the best spot possible to ride this fire out. We'll call in some air support. We'll see if we can get this fire knocked down before it gets to us. Everybody goes, great plan, boss. And up the canyon they go. So far, the team's working pretty well, right? Except for the decision to go back in. It appears that they've got a good risk mitigation plan. They drive up the canyon a couple of miles, and they come to this area where there's not a lot of trees at all. There's a big scree field of fallen rock on one side, but hardly any vegetation. And the creek is shallow but wide, and there's a good bit of water in it. In fact, there's a sandbar in the middle of the creek, probably big enough for all of them to get out there, and if they had to, deploy their fire shelters. Now, fire shelters are little aluminum foil tents. Every firefighter is trained to unpack it and deploy it quickly. And in many situations, it can be the difference between life and death in what's called a burnover. And that's what they're preparing for. So they stop and they brief it. This looks like the spot. And they pretty much all agree, yeah, this is the spot. Right? But the fire is still about an hour away. And so somehow complacency starts to creep in. And a couple of the more seasoned firefighters, including Tom Craven, he's the experienced one, the ex-athlete, the generational firefighter, charismatic guy. He goes up on the side of the hill, and if I recall correctly, they're smoking a cigarette or just shooting the breeze, keeping an eye on the fire as it slowly works its way up the canyon toward them. They call up some of the other folks who are down by the river, sort of milling around. They're not doing a lot of planning anymore. They've already just kind of planned it out. And one of the people that goes up on the hill in the scree field is a young lady named Rebecca Welch. Rebecca, first fire dispatch, rookie firefighter, is going to end up playing a significant role in this event because as the fire is getting closer and closer, L. Reese Daniels, who is the supervisor in charge, he is the de facto incident commander, starts calling the group down from the hill. Hey, you guys get down off there. Remember our plan. We're going to get down here. We're going to ride the fire out. And the whole time, L. Reese is on his radio trying to get some air support in there to knock the fire down, but it's still too smoky. They can't see well enough to do it. Well, the four never come down off the side of the hill. But for one reason or another, Rebecca Welch does. I'll come back to her in a minute. The reason I know a lot about this is I was actually on the investigation team for the incident, and it took us a while to sort through all of this. But you have experienced firefighters. You've got at least two leaders, one a formal leader, one an informal leader, and you've got some rookies there that they're trying to calm down. And here's where the team dynamics get a little weird, because the new firefighters are scared, and they should be, right? So should the experienced firefighters. But they react in this way, I guess you could call it overconfidence bias, like, hey, we've been through a lot of these things, don't worry, it'll be fine. Just stay here with me, whatever it is. And yet, at that very moment, there became what was reported as some conflict between L. Reese Daniels down saying, come on, get down off that hill, and these guys saying, hey, you don't tell us what to do, or we're fine. We've got good visibility up here. Now, what happens next is tragic, but somewhat predictable. Fires can move at 2 or 3 miles an hour for a long time and then explode. And that's what happened here. It came around the corner to where the sun had been baking these fuels all day, dead wood, grass, all of that stuff. And from a half mile away, this thing just blew up all around them. There was no time for the people that were standing on the road to even go the 10 feet across the creek to the sandbar where they said they were going to be. They just deployed their fire shelters right there. And so did the people up on the hill, right? So what ended up happening is 4 firefighters on the hill burned to death. And the ones that were down where they said they were supposed to be survived. Right? All of this could have been avoided at multiple places along this decision cycle. And it leads us into this discussion of how will you respond, right? And so let's take a look. Eventually, the person who was in charge sort of gave up being in charge. The charismatic leader up on the hill never really took charge in a positive way to get people to safety. These are tremendously courageous people, wildland firefighters. And for those that were experienced, they were extremely well trained. But they weren't trained for this particular mix of situational and interpersonal events. So as a result of all this, the people that survive end up down by the river, and all of a sudden one more strange thing happens, and that is two tourists come down the canyon saying, "We heard there's a fire and we're trying to get out of here. Oh, here are these firefighters, we're saved." Nobody actually took hold of them and said, "Okay, here's what you do," except one person, the rookie firefighter, Rebecca Welsh, who dragged them into the river and sheltered them under her fire shelter, which is only built for one person. So why was it that people that had decades of experience couldn't make good decisions, but someone with no experience made great decisions? And that's still a mystery all these years later, 20 odd years later to me. But I got a chance to interview Rebecca and found a few interesting things about her. She definitely had leadership background. I believe she'd been captain of her college basketball team, and she didn't have a fire background, but she knew enough to be afraid, and then knew that when you're afraid, you need to take positive actions to ensure your safety. There didn't seem to be anyone else on that team that took action to bring the team together, right? When it didn't happen from the leadership, it also didn't happen organically. So at the end of the day, this was a big deal, right? Anytime forest fire people die and burn over, something failed, and we did an incredibly detailed investigation. And as a result of it, there were actually criminal charges filed against Elreese Daniels, the leader, right? And originally, they included manslaughter, lying to public officials. I'm trying to remember all the charges. At the end of it all, though, I think the federal prosecutor realized they had overreached. There was a huge backlash of how can you hold somebody criminally liable when they're making tactical decisions under this kind of stress, right? As a result, even though he started out being charged with 11 felonies, 4 counts of manslaughter, 7 counts of making false statements, it was all reduced down to 2 misdemeanor false statement charges. But it didn't get settled until 2008, so these things lag on for years. The impact was the controversy over criminalization of tactical errors led to something called the Cantwell-Hastings Bill, mandating Office of Inspector General level investigations. And it got us thinking about things like accountability versus blame, right? And we did a lot of things, policy and training reforms. We made it easier for people to speak up, created more psychologically safe kind of CRM level training for firefighters. But I tell you that story in some detail to illustrate that under extreme life and death conditions, weird things happen, even to people that you would never guess they would, people that have all these certifications. So how will you respond? And I'll tell you a little bit about my stories. Not in detail, but just the fact that one particular event, a mid-air collision back in 1983 between 2 big airplanes. I was a brand new second lieutenant, a co-pilot, less than 400 hours flying time. But I had been a student, a pretty good student along the way. I knew all my systems. I knew enough to run the checklists. And for me, when that event happened, I was scared for about 30 seconds, but then my brain went into fast overdrive, right? I instantly realized we've lost this hydraulic system. This is what it means. We're going to have to crank down the flaps. We've got to do this. I was outpacing the rest of the team. And finally, my aircraft commander reached across, literally put a hand on my chest and said, "Slow down, we're going to be okay," right? And so I realized then that the excitement of the event, even though I realized it might be a life-ending event, sort of overcame my fear. And that was a very similar thing that happened in the second near-death experience that I had. But I was a little bit more prepared for that one. So a couple of things that I always do, and this might be useful to you, it may not, but I always run worst-case scenarios through my head. I kind of, I'm walking into someplace new, or I'm parking my car and I say, okay, what if I come out here and there's somebody trying to carjack me, or I get in there and somebody pulls a gun in the store and tries to do an armed robbery. And I have little mantras that I've been trained on. Everybody out there that's ever had active shooter training knows the 3 words, right? Run, hide, fight. Anything happens, unless you're in a particular position and armed yourself to stop it, you run away, right? As quickly as you can. You hide. And then if people are coming through and trying to do you harm, then and only then do you fight. Right? So that's a simple little mantra: run, hide, fight, that you can remember under the stress of the moment. So run worst case scenarios through your head. If you're going on a long trip, what if I have a flat tire? What if I break down? How far is it to the next gas station? All those kinds of things are preparing you for that time when you will have a situation that doesn't necessarily map to that, but you've trained your brain to think about worst case scenarios, right? The second thing is, when you're training your brain to think against worst case scenarios, you can fight back against the panic, right? Even though you're going to be scared as hell initially, like every human being on earth, when something crazy blows up in your face, like that fire did for these firefighters, or those shots rang out from that mountain in Idaho last night, you collapse into, this is what I've been preparing for. I'm trained, or I'm ready for this. And then you stay in the moment. You don't project worst case scenarios anymore. Now you're in the moment, operating to increase your margins of safety and chances for survival, and improving other people's safety and survival as well. And the last little bit of guidance that I've developed for myself is, it's not over until it is, right? Sometimes the hardest part of an emergency is forgetting to return to normal procedures, right? I can't tell you how many accidents I've read about where somebody handled an emergency perfectly and then landed gear up back at the base because they didn't run their normal procedure checklist. So I think there's parallels for these two firefighting incidents to a lot of different fields, right? Aviation is one we've mentioned, but healthcare, you're operating on somebody and suddenly the biology explodes in front of you, and you're not sure that you recognize what's going on and what to do next. Obviously, military operations, right? Any decisions that occur under uncertainty with life or death consequences. And then probably finally, when you survive it, and you've got to believe you will, debrief every aspect of it. I'm still learning things from that 30-mile fire. I'm still learning things from my 1983 9 December at 1332 Zulu midair collision about myself and about responses, right? And that fuels, of course, what this podcast is all about: continuous improvement, right? You don't have to be a firefighter or cop or, a Delta Force person or even a human performance expert to understand how these lessons can apply to you, because we're all one decision or one event away from being in a life or death situation. So I guess we'll finish up with a call to action. Think through worst case scenarios. Reflect on emergencies that have happened in your own life or people you know. Think a little bit about what worked and what didn't work, what you would have changed, right? Because it's all about situational awareness and self-awareness. And when you're aware of the situation, you're aware of how you may or may not respond in that situation, you can learn. So, like always, please share this episode with anybody you think could learn from it. And we'll be back next Tuesday, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, to deal with a little bit more on leadership under pressure. We're going to go a little bit deeper with a couple more case studies on that one. So we'll see you again next Tuesday.